In this video, we're going to talk about how we'll be storing the data for our Notes application. Now, we already know how we're getting that data into the program. For now, it's via command line arguments, which we have support for thanks to yargs. The question we are aiming to answer here is, what do we do with that data when our application gets it? We need to figure out how we can save it, so if someone adds a note and then comes back tomorrow, they can load that note up once again to read it or edit it. For this app, we'll be using the FS core module to save all of our notes data to the file system. Now, what exactly is going to go inside of that file? Well, it's going to be JSON data. So JSON is something that's already come up before with our package lock.json and package.json files. Both of these use the JSON format to store and structure their data. We're going to do the exact same thing to store our notes inside of a text file. So we're going to have an array of objects where each object represents a note, and each object will have various properties like title and body. And by working with JSON, we're going to be able to read and write to the file system, saving and loading our data. JSON is something we're going to be using extensively throughout the class in every single application. In this app, we'll be using it to save our notes. In the next app, we'll be using it as the communication standard when we fetch real-time weather data from back-end services. After that, we'll be using it when we create our own API with Node.js, and we'll even be using JSON in our real-time application at the end of the class. So JSON is a format you're going to run into over and over again, and the good news is that it has native support in JavaScript and it's super easy to work with, since it's essentially just arrays and objects with various properties. Now, since we are going to use JSON so much throughout the class, I want to take a quick moment to explore it in isolation before we try to integrate it into the Notes app. That's going to make sure we really understand how it works and how we can use it inside of JavaScript and Node.js. So for the moment, what we're going to do is close down all open files, and we're going to collapse the Notes app directory, and we're going to create a new folder in the root of the project called Playground. Now, the Playground directory is not going to contain a new application. This is a place I'm going to use at various points throughout the course for times when we want to create a little one-off script to explore a specific topic. We'll use it maybe a dozen different times throughout the class. For now, we're going to use it to explore JSON. Right here, all we're going to do is create a single new script. I'm going to call it one-json.js. We'll create other scripts throughout the course as we need to mess around with new topics. And let's go ahead and kick things off by talking about the data we're going to end up working with. JSON works really well with objects and arrays in JavaScript, and that's a good thing because we're going to use objects and arrays to model all of our data. An object can model something like a book or a user or a note, which has various properties to describe it in detail. And if we have an array of those things, then we have an array of items like we would in any database. Right here, as an example, let's start with a book variable whose value will be a new object. Now, there are plenty of properties you could use to model a book. We're going to stick with just two. We'll have the title for the book, which will be a string, and we'll have the author for the book as well. I'll use a book on my bookshelf. Ego is the enemy for this example, and the author for that particular book is Ryan Holiday. It's a great book, definitely worth checking out. So now we have our data stored as a JavaScript object, and the goal is to convert this into JSON, which is nothing more than a string, so we can do something with it, like save it to the file system. The FS core module only knows how to work with string data, so we need to figure out how we can take an object, represent it as a string to save it, then load that back in and get the original object back. The first method we're going to look at is JSON. That's uppercase JSON.stringify. This is a JavaScript method that takes in an object or an array or any value for that matter, and it returns the JSON string representation. So in our case, we can pass the book variable in as the one and only argument, and what it returns is our JSON data. So over here on the left-hand side, I can create a variable like book JSON to keep the variable names unique. Then we can go ahead and log this to the console using console.log book JSON. Perfect. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and actually run things. So from the terminal down below, we have to switch directories. I'll be using cd ... to get out of the notes directory, then /playground to go into that directory, all with a single command. From here, I will use clear to clear the terminal output, then we'll run our script. Node space 1 JSON.js. I run it, and what do I get? I get my data showing up. Now you'll notice that it looks pretty much like a JavaScript object. The only difference is that all of our single quotes have been converted to double quotes, and double quotes have been added to all property names, which I mentioned a bit earlier in the course is indeed a requirement with JSON. So book JSON is a string, it is not an object. If I tried to access a property like bookJSON.title, it's not going to exist. The book object has the title property, the JSON data does not. If I run the program, we can see we get undefined. It is unable to find that property. Now, this is the part in the program where we would typically do something like save the JSON data to the file system so we could load it in later and work with it, and we will get there in just a few seconds. Before we do, I want to explore the opposite of JSON.stringify. JSON.stringify takes in the object and gives us a JSON string back. We also have access to JSON.parse, which takes in the JSON string and gives us back the object. So right here, I am going to pass to the parse method our JSON data. We have that stored on the book JSON variable, and parse returns the object or array. It returns the parsed JSON. So right here, I'll create a new const called parsed data, storing it equal to whatever comes back from the parse method. Now we have our original object back, and we can do something like console.log parsed data.author to get the actual author value. I'm going to save json.js. I'm going to rerun the script, and I get Ryan Holiday printing. So we were indeed able to access a property on parsed data because parsed data is indeed a JavaScript object. So these are the two core methods for working with JSON. JSON stringify to take an object and convert it to JSON, and JSON parse to take JSON data in and convert it to an object. Now let's integrate what we know about JSON with the file system. So I am going to load that in up above, creating an fs variable and requiring the fs module, and we're going to use that method we've used before, write file sync to write some data. Right here, we can remove everything except for the line where we create our JSON. We'll remove our two logs as well as the call to json.parse. And all we're going to do is use fs.writeFileSync to create a new file. Now I'm going to call this something like 1-json.json since we're storing JSON data. It's not a text file. Then we're going to provide the data we want to write. And in this case, we are going to pass in our JSON data, book JSON, the variable. Now, if we save the program and rerun things, we're going to have a brand new file in that playground directory. And if we crack that open, what do we have? We have our JSON data saved, which is awesome. We could even use Visual Studio Code to format this data in a nicer way, or we could do that manually, or we could just leave it as is. But clearly, we have our title property, ego is the enemy, and we have our author, Ryan Holiday. This is now JSON data we could load in at a later time and reuse. So let's go ahead and see how we would get that done as well. We're going to load in that file using another fs method. We're going to parse it, and we're going to access the data. To do this, let's go ahead and start by commenting out all of the code that creates the book variable and writes to the file, since we already have the file written. And we're going to start by using a method called fs.readFileSync. ReadFileSync, as the name suggests, is going to allow us to read a file, and we pass to it just a single argument. In this case, it is the name we used up above with writeFileSync. So we are trying to read the following file, 1-json.json. Now that we have the fs.readFileSync call in place, we can go ahead and grab its return value, which is going to contain the contents of the file. Now we can create a variable to store the contents that came back, and I'm going to call this something like data buffer. Now, why am I calling it buffer? Because what comes back is not a string. It is actually a buffer, which is a way for Node.js to represent binary data, and we could see this down below. Console.log, data buffer, and what we're not going to get is the contents of our file as we see them. Instead, we're going to get some buffer data. I'll run the script down below, and right here we have those bits and bytes. Now, if we actually want to get our string back, there is a toString method we can use to get the string back as we would have expected. And if I run this script again with toString in place, there we are indeed getting our data being read from the file system. So we have the data buffer variable, then down below we can create a data JSON variable. And here we're just going to use data buffer dot toString. Perfect. So now we have our JSON that we've read from the file system, and we can go ahead and parse it right here. I'm going to create a const called data. I'll be using JSON.parse to parse it, and we have that data on the data JSON variable. Now we have our data and we can do something with it. I could, for example, console.log a property off of it. Let's go ahead and try data.title, which should indeed exist since we have the title and title and author properties on our data. Right here, I'm going to save the program. I'm going to run things, and I correctly get ego is the enemy. So we read the file in, getting our binary data. We then converted that data into a standard string in JavaScript. We then parsed that JSON data into an object, and finally, we accessed a property from it. So there we go. We now know how to work with JSON data in JavaScript, and we also know how to read it and write it from the file system, which is everything we need to be able to do to work with our notes application, actually saving a user's notes. Now it's challenge time, and I have a fun one lined up. So right here, I am going to comment out a code that we just wrote, making sure this script does nothing in its current state. And what we're going to do is first pull up some JSON data that you're going to work with for this challenge. You can find that by heading over to the browser and going to links.mead.io / it is JSON-sample. When you go to this URL, which is a bit.ly link, it's going to redirect you over to some JSON data we're going to use for this challenge. Right here, that URL redirects me over to a GitHub gist, and right here I have a little bit of JSON data. I'm going to copy that entire JSON file. I'm going to bring it over to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to paste it right inside of our existing JSON file. And you can see that Visual Studio Code has actually automatically formatted it for me. I can see that we have a name value of Andrew, a planet of Earth, and an age of 27. And now let's go ahead and talk about what exactly I'd like you to do for this challenge. And we're going to do that over here in the JSON.js file. Down below, I'm going to add a few empty lines and paste in the challenge comments. Your job is to work with JSON and the file system to complete this one. First up, you are going to load and parse the JSON data, the data that we just pasted in to the JSON file. So we want to make sure we get an actual JavaScript object out of that like we did above. Then you're going to alter that object, changing the name and age property to match up with your information. You're going to leave Earth alone since I'm pretty sure that's where you currently live. If not, hello from another planet. Now, once you have name and age edited in the object in this file, you want to stringify that object and override the original data. So right here, you're going to use what we learned about stringification and writing JSON to override the contents of this file with the new information. Then you're going to test your work by running the script and viewing the data over here. You should see a new value for name and a new value for age, which line up with the values you chose. Take as much time as you need to knock this out. You have everything you need just up above in order to get this done. When you are done, don't forget to test your work, then come back and click play. How'd that go? Let's go ahead and jump right in by first parsing the data. So right here, I'm going to create a variable, something along the lines of data buffer. We will be using fs.readFileSync to load that JSON data in, the file 1-json.json. Next up, we're going to convert that to a string. So data JSON, which is going to be a string, will get its value from using the buffers to string method. So data buffer dot to string perfect. From here, we can parse that into an object. So I'm going to call this one user. You could have called it data or anything you wanted. And I'll be using JSON.parse to parse my data JSON variable. Right here, data uppercase JSON. So now we've completed step 1. We've loaded the data in and we've parsed it. Step 2 is to change that data. I'm going to set user.name equal to a different name from my own. I'll go ahead and use something like Gunther. Then I'm going to update the age, user.age. Let's go ahead and say that he's 54. That completes step 2. Now we're going to stringify that object and save it exactly like we did up above. So right here, we are going to create something like user JSON, getting its value from JSON.stringify. What are we trying to stringify? That user object. Once we have that, we can write it using fs.write file sync. We are writing to the exact same file. I wanted you to override the original data. So right here, 1-json.json is the file name where we got our data from, and we have to pass in the data we want to write. We have that in the user JSON string. Excellent. Now that we have this in place, we can test our work. So over in the JSON file, we have the data we had before. I have Andrew and 27. Down below in the terminal, I'm going to rerun the exact same script we were running before, and right away we can see the data has changed. I have a name value of Gunther, which has changed. I have a planet value of Earth, which has stayed the same, and I have an age of 54, which is indeed unique. That is the value I used over here. Now that we have this in place, we know how to work with JSON, and we know how to work with JSON with respect to the file system, so we are ready to move on to the next video and actually use all of this to save notes in the Notes application. The reason I spent so much time talking about just JSON in this video is because we're going to use it so much throughout the class, and I wanted you to have a good grasp of exactly what it is. It is nothing more than a string representation of what looks like an object or an array. Over inside of our JSON file, I'll remove all of the commented out code to clean things up, leaving just our little challenge example, although I don't believe we'll actually be coming back to this file throughout the rest of the class, and that's where we're going to stop for this one. I'll see you in the next one.